Hi, and welcome to another video where I talk about some instruments that I play. I already made one on the duduk, which you can find on the channel, and today I'm going to be talking about another instrument, which is probably one of my main instruments and also one of my favorite instruments in the whole world, and that is the oud. The oud is a string instrument, it's a lute instrument technically, and one that is especially popular and played in the Middle East, North Africa, and sort of Central Asian region. It has a very long history, but this of course depends on how we sort of define our terms. Long-necked and short-necked lutes have been around for thousands of years, possibly back to Babylonian times at least. But if we talk about the oud as we know it today, we usually say that it originates in Persia as an instrument called the barbat. And after this, with the advent or the spread of the Arab civilization or Islamic civilization, it also became popular and adopted by the Arabs and the Persians as it sort of spread across new lands. And when the Arabs adopted it, it became known in Arabic as oud or al-oud, which means wood. The scholars debate why it was called wood or oud, and many argue that it was because it was rather unusual for the oud to have a wooden soundboard, as this one does, as most instruments at that time used some sort of skin as a soundboard. Now, in this new empire, the sort of Islamic civilization, the Abbasid and Umayyad caliphates, the oud became a very popular instrument across this empire. It was played in many different circumstances and contexts, from taverns to the courts of the Abbasid caliphs. One of the most famous early oud players is a man by the name of Ishaq al-Mawsili, who played in the court of the famous caliph Harun al-Rashid and is thought to have been a master at playing the oud. His student is also very famous and is known as Ziryab, which means blackbird, and he was also educated in Baghdad before sort of eventually moving or traveling to Spain, into Cordoba, where he established a music school of his own. Now, interestingly, of course, the fact that this oud spread thus from Persia and the Arab sort of region to Spain makes it very obvious to us that the oud is a direct ancestor to the European lute. You can even hear this in the name of the instrument. Lute comes from al-oud. So you put those together, al-oud becomes al-oud and lute, and so on. You can see the resemblance. You can also see it physically in the aesthetics of the instrument, as it's very similar to a European lute. The body of the oud is made primarily of a rounded back, which is made of sort of individual bent pieces of wood, like on a lute. And then it has a soundboard, which is made of different materials. This one is made of spruce. There are others that are made from cedar wood and so on. The sort of main body of the oud is traditionally, it was used walnut wood to make this kind of wood. The neck or the head is it has a bent neck, much like a lute, and the pegs are tension pegs that are tuned by friction, basically, as opposed to like a guitar, which has machine head pegs. Unlike the European lute, we don't play with our fingers, but instead with a pick or plectrum, which is known in Arabic as a risha. And traditionally, what was used was actually an eagle's quill to play. And there are some like ethnomusicologists who are also oud players, like Omar Metioui in Morocco, who still sometimes play with an eagle's quill. But for the most part, people use plastic plectrums or rishas, like this one. They're usually pretty large. They look like big sort of ice cream sticks, basically, and they're held sort of between the thumb and the rest of the fingers, like this. A lot of people also use cow's horn for the risha, usually sort of professional players. which has a bit more sort of clean sound, less sound from these strikes and more from the actual strings. The strings of the oud today usually are nylon strings, but in the Middle Ages and previous in history, they often used guts, so sheep's guts, basically. The oud was and is so popular in the Middle East that it has been referred to as the Sultan of instruments. The early Muslim philosophers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, the group Ikhwan al-Safa and Ibn Sina all wrote sort of treatises and large texts, philosophical texts that included the oud as a very important subject. When they wrote on music theory, for example, they always used the oud to sort of show and explain these theories, and most of them were also oud players. Al-Kindi, in fact, who is often referred to as the first Muslim philosopher, refers to the oud as the instrument of the philosophers. And both the Ikhwan al-Safa and Ibn Sina says that the oud is basically the most exalted and finest instruments in existence. And in these philosophical texts, they talk about the oud in a sort of very detailed manner. They talk about the shape of the body, the measurements of the neck and the body, how the strings are tied, how many strings there are, how the frets are to be tied, how every single detail is basically described in these texts, which is, of course, very useful today when we try to recreate what the oud may have looked like. As you may guess, of course, the modern oud looks quite different from the way it looked back then, but because of these texts, among other things, it has retained at least much of its characteristic features and qualities. Traditionally, in the Middle Ages, the oud had 4 strings, or sometimes 5, and according to these old philosophical texts, these strings were always tuned in perfect fourths. And these strings also had certain names. So these 4 strings are roughly equivalent to the top 4 strings of the modern oud, and the lowest of these was called bam, followed by mathlath, and then mathna, and lastly zir. At some point, a 5th higher string was added, which was called had, but this was eventually removed, and then people kept experimenting until we reached the sort of modern oud after a lot of centuries. And the modern oud is rather different. It has 6 strings, or I should say 5 double courses of sort of double strings tuned in the same note, so, and then 1 low bass string. And so the top sort of 4 strings of the modern oud is still tuned in perfect fourths, so you have C, G, D, A, and then it gets a bit different. So the next sort of lower 5th string is usually in F, and then the lowest string is a single C string. So that means you have 1 full octave. Another very interesting feature of the oud is, of course, that it is, at least today, fretless, which means it doesn't have any frets like a guitar. Originally, or in the Middle Ages, this doesn't seem to be the case. Many of these old texts by these philosophers like Ibn Sina often talk about how the oud should be fretted based on the sort of scales that were developed at this time. And so that seems to indicate that the oud was originally fretted. However, there are also paintings from this period that show the oud without frets. So scholars and historians don't really agree on if the oud was fretted or not. Some say that frets were used theoretically, but in actual practice they weren't. Others say that frets were always used. We just don't know. What is certain is that the frets were completely removed probably sometime during the Ottoman times, possibly in the 16th or 17th century, and today this is the norm. Now, the fact that the oud doesn't have any frets is very convenient, since in Arabic and Persian and Turkish music theory, we use what's known as microtones or quarter notes, which are notes that stand in between the half and full or whole step in a scale. And the theory or the system of Arabic and Turkish music theory is known as maqamat, which is the plural of maqam. And a maqam is a very complex subject. Some translate it as a mode, some also view it as a scale, but both of these don't really capture the actual meaning and are very much oversimplifications. It's similar to a scale in the sense that a maqam is made up essentially of a collection of certain notes, but it doesn't function in the same way as Western scales at all. Now this music system, maqamat or the maqams, was sort of started to be developed in the Middle Ages by a lot of these philosophers who were also, as I mentioned, music theoreticians. So for example, Al-Farabi wrote a book called the Kitab al-Musiqa al-Kabir, which means the great book of music, where he talks about tetrachords and pentachords and scales and a bunch of music theory. Same with people like Ibn Sina, or also known as Avicenna, but probably the most important music theorist in the Middle Ages, or for all Arabic music basically, is a man by the name of Safi ad-Din Urmawi, who lived in the 13th century. And he wrote a book, among other things, he wrote a book called Kitab al-Adwar. And in this book, he very much systematizes the maqams, the modes of Arabic music. And importantly, he divides the octave into 17 intervals. Of course, in Western music, the octave is divided into 12 intervals. And Urmawi's 17 intervals, of course, includes these microtones, these quarter notes. And while, of course, music theory or in the Arabic and Persian and Turkish world have developed since then a lot of these maqams and these theories are still prevalent. So when we talk about maqams, we should immediately sort of get rid of the idea of scales in the Western sense. The only thing it has in common with scales is that it consists of a certain collection of notes. But other than that, it's quite different. Maqams, very importantly, are made up of tetrachords, pentachords, and sometimes trichords. That means sort of mini scales of 3, 4, or 5 notes. And these are known in Arabic as jins, or ajnas in plural. Now these jins, these tetrachords, for example, when combined, create maqam music. And you can also modulate a lot with this. So for example, you can have a jins like jins Hijaz, which is very familiar to some Western ears, as it is often the scale that is employed to evoke sort of Arabic vibes in movies and such things. And the Hijaz jins sounds like this. Pretty familiar. That's a tetrachord, that's 4 notes. Now, there's another tetrachord, or actually a pentachord, called Nahawand, which is equivalent to the Western minor scale, which sounds like this. Now, if we combine the Hijaz jins followed by a Nahawand, suddenly we have a full maqam, which is a regular Hijaz maqam, and it sounds like this. That's a full octave. So maqams are made up of these mini scales called jins. If you change the second tetrachord from a regular Nahawand, there's a sort of minor scale in the Western form, to actually 2 other jins, 2 other tetrachords, which are known as nirkiz and as Hijaz, another Hijaz, or Hijaz Qad, it's called in this case, you end up with another maqam, which is known as Hijaz Qad, and it sounds like this. Love that sound. And these maqams are also often modulated. And there's also always a note in these jins, which is usually the last note. So the last note of the first jins is called ghamas, and that is also the first note of the second jins. And this is a very important note because this is where you can modulate. So for Hijaz you have... So the G here is the ghamas, and here you start the next, so you can do... Or Now, where it gets really fun is, of course, when we start including maqams that have, or jins that have quarter notes. One of the most famous of these is a maqam or jins known as bayati, also sometimes known as ushaq. And if we play that in D, it starts with the tonic, then followed by a quarter note, which is between the half and the whole step. So it's sounds very strange, obviously, to Western ears. We're used to hearing or. So the bayati played in the full sort of jins sounds like this. And usually a nahawand is added after. So a bayati sort of maqam melody could sound something like. Another one of the most common maqams in all of Arabic music is known as rast, which also has quarter notes. And rast in C sounds like this. There's a pentachord, basically. Now, what's interesting here is that the rast in C are the exact same notes as the bayati in D, except that a different sort of note is emphasized or used as the tonic. So rast in C, of course, as I said, is, whereas bayati is. So this is another example of how maqams work, where you modulate between different, sort of emphasizing different notes to get different atmospheres or different vibes. Maqams are not just these notes or these sort of scales or modes, they're also certain sort of phrasings or kinds of phrasings that are often returning. There are also certain moods or styles that you usually play when you play a certain maqam. It's a very complicated subject, and I don't even have a full grasp of it. But it's a fascinating world that's very different from Western music theory, and one that is very fun to sort of dive into and to discover. As I said, historically the oud has been played in many different contexts, from taverns to courts of the caliphs and sultans. It's also been used in religious music, particularly Sufi music, like in the Mevlevi order in Turkey, the order that was founded by the famous Persian poet Jalaluddin Rumi. And the Mevlevi order has these very famous whirling dervishes, and in this ceremony, which is known as Ayin, they usually have an oud that's playing as well. And so the oud has developed over the centuries from the early period in Persia to its spread across the Arab and North African world. And of course it became the lute when it came to Europe, and also then of course being the ancestor of the modern guitar in that same way. In today's world, the oud is played all over the Middle East, in North Africa, in Iran. It is also played in Turkey, in Greece, Armenia. It's an instrument that is widely played across the world. And then of course if you count the lute as, or the European lute as a form of oud, the range is even broader. But because of this, there are a few different variants of this instrument. So usually we say that this, for example, is called an Arabic oud. This one was made in Egypt in 2013. And the Arabic oud is usually rather large. It has a sort of deep, round tone to it, and a kind of a bit longer neck. Now there's another variant of the oud that's often known as a Turkish oud that's played in Turkey, obviously, and in Greece and Armenia. And this oud is usually rather smaller. It has a different, sort of more rounded shape sometimes, and its sound is a lot lighter and sort of has more sustain to it. Then there's another variant that's sometimes called Iranian oud, or sometimes barbat. Remember, the oud stems from an old Persian instrument called the barbat, and there's been a kind of revival of that instrument where people are trying to recreate it. And that instrument, or that variant of the oud, also has quite a distinct character to it as well. So this is an example of a Turkish oud. So as you can see, it looks quite different from the Arabic version. It's a lot smaller, and the shape is quite different. The neck is shorter, and it has slightly different sound. Now I have modified this oud now. I've taken away most of the strings, so it's only 4 single strings, and it sounds terrible, so I'm not going to play it for you. But I just wanted to show you how different it can look. There are also more modern variants like electric ouds, and this is an example of an electric oud. The shape of this particular one is more close to the Turkish one than the Arabic one. But of course the electric oud is a very different sound since you plug it into an amplifier. If you want to hear me play this instrument in particular, you can watch another sort of video on my channel where I play this one. So the oud is a fascinating instrument that has a very long history. It has been used in many different contexts. It's used today in traditional Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Greek, Armenian music. It's used in religious ceremonies like the Sufi music of the Mevlevi order. It's used in modern ensembles like rock music or trance music and electronic music. It's basically all over the world at this point. And it seems that its popularity is actually growing, which is very fun. Now, I've been talking a lot, but what better way to show you the oud than to actually play it. I'm going to end by playing a taqsim, which is an improvisation that's usually played before a longer instrumental piece, but I'll be just doing the taqsim in this case. And in this improvisation, I'll be playing in the Maqam Sab'a, which is another maqam that contains certain quarter notes and is one of my favorite maqams. It has this wonderful, dark, mysterious sound, which you'll hear.